Hello again. I am really excited for our next session. Our summit talks are an opportunity for us to dig a little deeper into specific issues around language access. I already referenced one that we did for our first summit that focused around refugee story of coming to America and sort of the implications and why we need language access. Today, I'm actually pleased to introduce our summit talk speaker, Michelle Bishop. She is the voting rights specialist at the National Disability Rights Network. She has provided public testimony to the EAC, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and was a founding member of the Research Alliance on Accessible Voting. I am also proud to call her a friend and a fantastic colleague in our fight to make voting accessible for all. So I would like to turn it over to Michelle at this point.
I'm sorry, does no one else here speak ASL, American Sign Language? No? Okay. That's mostly a relief because actually neither do I. So I'll go ahead and do this in English. If you're also wondering why on earth this session is called Thank You, You're Bad, Sea Turtle, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. It's all going to make sense by the end, okay? All right. For right now, I'd like you to just hold on to that feeling of discomfort that you felt when I got up here and I first started speaking at you in sign language. I could see it on a lot of your faces. That moment when you were thinking, oh no, is she going to sign at me for a full 15 minutes and I have no idea what she's saying? Now I want you to imagine that you were walking to a polling place and I was the poll worker giving you the instructions you needed to be able to cast your ballot. And hold on to that feeling of dread and horror. That's how it feels for voters who are deaf and hard of hearing when they walk into a lot of America's polling places. And I bet for a lot of you who are advocates, who are speakers of other languages yourselves, that should feel familiar, right? We know exactly what that's like. But let's take a moment to talk specifically about people who are deaf and hard of hearing and deaf culture and how exactly we got to this point in the first place. Maybe some common misconceptions we have about people who are deaf and hard of hearing. This is actually Marlee Matlin, right? She's probably the most famous deaf person in America. She's a best-selling author. She's an Academy Award-winning actress, and she's incredibly talented. But when we think about deaf people in America, we tend to think about Marlee. And as cool as she is, that can be a little bit problematic. Because a lot of times in the context in which we see Marlee, she is a lone deaf person working to thrive in a hearing world, an English-speaking world. Marlee can read your lips pretty darn well, and she knows what you're saying, and she can even speak back to you in your language. She can speak English back to you. And so communication is working for her pretty well, especially when we see her in films and TV shows where she is the only deaf person that exists in that universe. This isn't the reality of what it's like to be deaf or hard of hearing in America. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's talk about what it actually looks like. Let's start with that concept of what that communication looks like. Only about 30% of speech can actually be read on the lips. This means that the very best lip readers are only catching 1/3 of what you're saying. And they're trying to use context clues to fill in the rest. 1/3. Let's take an example of that. Here is a little cut off, but you get the idea, right? This is a little speech I might have given this morning. This is a little speech I might have actually started very poorly signing at you this morning. Oh, thank you to whoever adjusted that slide. I'll give you a moment to look at it. This is what that same speech looks like if you were in this audience and you're deaf and you're lip reading while I'm speaking. This is what it looks like to catch only every 1 in 3 words. It's hardly enough to figure out what that really simple paragraph says. But when we're talking about the instructions for checking in and showing your proper ID and casting your ballot, it would be virtually impossible to figure out what the poll worker is trying to tell you. That is the reality of what oral English communication is like for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now let's talk about written English. So there are some statistics out there that tell us that 50% of deaf students graduate from secondary school with a 4th grade reading level or less. That statistic's a little bit debatable, and arguably that means that half of deaf people are more proficient in written English. So it's not horrible news. It's also not terribly hard behind hearing people either. But the concept that written English is going to be completely accessible to everyone who's deaf and hard of hearing just doesn't hold up. And there are reasons for this, if we think about it. A lot of people today who are deaf start learning to sign from birth and are introduced to English later on in life. A lot of people who are deaf also attend segregated schools. If you don't know what a school for the deaf is, you could actually look one up right now on your phone. Maybe not right now, maybe during someone else's presentation. But you could look it up today on your phone and learn about this whole other world that you might not even know about. But there's really something greater at work here. And this is really this is the heart of what we're getting to today. And that's that ASL is not English. It is not an adapted version of English. It's not a signed version of English. ASL is its own completely separate language. Although we share a common alphabet, ASL does not exist in a spoken or a written form like English. It exists through hand signs. It also has totally different syntax. There's completely different sentence structure. The way we put words together to build a phrase does not necessarily mirror English. ASL is its own language. And that brings us to the one thing you should remember today, and that's that all this time, we have barrier issues because we have been putting deaf people in the wrong box. We think of people who are deaf and hard of hearing as people with disabilities, but a great number of deaf people do not consider themselves disabled. They consider themselves speakers of another language. They're fluent in ASL. So when we talk about access to the vote, this is where I want us to start to shift our paradigm a little bit. Access to the vote for people who are deaf isn't necessarily a disability issue. We don't need a ramp. This is a language access issue. The greatest barrier for people who are deaf in a polling place is not that they can't hear, it's that you don't speak ASL. This is a language issue, and that's why we're talking about it at a Language Access Summit. So now that we've talked about this new paradigm, let's talk about some of the things that we're doing at polling places, some of which you got a sneak preview of during other sessions, that maybe aren't necessarily working as well as we'd hoped. When you first go into your polling place, the very first interaction you have with that election is all those posters we put up, right? There's signs everywhere, and they tell you where to go and where to check in and what type of ID you need to have and what you're going to do next. And a lot of them are big and they're chock full of text, and some really great posters are totally written in legalese because they're very complex concepts. For people with a literacy rate at 4th grade or below, for people for whom English is not their primary language, we might as well be posting this in a lot of America's polling places. A lot of these materials are not accessible for people for whom English is not their first language. Now, granted, if your first language is a written language and there's a poster right next to it that has your language, maybe that's a different issue, but that doesn't capture all language. Then you get up there to go check in and you talk to the poll worker, and I cannot stress enough that yelling at a deaf person does not make them undeaf. They can't hear you. And it makes it harder to lip read because you're doing this bizarre movement with your mouth that no one really does. No, seriously, we have to stop yelling at deaf people. Not only does it not work, but it's considered culturally offensive in many cases. Which brings me to one of the preferred solutions out there. Now, I will say, pen and paper works in many cases. There are a lot of people who are deaf and hard of hearing who are completely proficient in written English, who prefer this mode of communication. It's low cost and it's easy. I'm not going to knock it. But it's not going to work for everyone. And that's something that I think we're just going to have to accept, especially when we talk about polling places with really long lines and nervous poll workers who are trying to convey really complex information while scribbling it down. And who says their handwriting is that great anyway? I will say, if you're going to do this, one of the things that I think works a little better that I do all the time as someone who is not fluent in ASL is to use the speech-to-text on my smartphone. You all know you have one. And then show the speech that was typed onto the phone from my voice on the screen of my phone. It's just so much quicker. But that's a complete aside, because we're about to get to my absolute favorite form of accommodation for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Election day job aids for poll workers. Because we for some reason believe that we can give a one-pager with a few basic signs to a poll worker with limited training, and they will somehow be proficient enough in ASL to communicate with a deaf person who is fluent in ASL. This is not a real thing, and it's not going to happen. And I can't imagine that we're doing this in any other language. I'm actually looking at Terry now, because if we are, I'm a little bit horrified. No, she's nodding her head. We are not doing this for any other languages, because we know it's just not going to work. You're not going to teach someone an entirely new language in a few minutes. So, okay, at this point, admittedly, you're probably thinking, Michelle is going to tell us that we have to have a sign language interpreter stationed in every polling place in America. I'm going to say first, that would be amazing, and I wish we had that. If you can do that, go for it. I'm also going to say, I realize how difficult that is. It's quite costly. Now, that part doesn't bother me, because I do this for a living, but there's also a known shortage of sign language interpreters, certified real sign language interpreters, in many parts of the country, which is probably also very familiar for you who work with other languages as well. There's such a known shortage of sign language interpreters that there's an entire fraud industry that has developed around this. I'm going to show you the best example. If anyone remembers the memorial service that was held for Nelson Mandela after he passed in 2013, you might remember this man. Not President Obama. I assume you all remember President Obama. But the man who's front and center on this slide, who put on credentials, was presumably going to be paid quite well, stood next to multiple world leaders, and was broadcast on international television faking sign language because he's not a real interpreter. Not only did he do it, but he was televised internationally. That's him standing next to the President of the United States doing this. That's horrifying, if you remember this, and a lot of you nodded at me, so I think you do. But I want to say that that's not an isolated incident. This happens every day, and it happens in the United States. There are known cases of fraudulent sign language interpreters at police press conferences, at emergency communications during natural disasters, where information that's necessary to survive is being conveyed, and hospitals every day. We're translating information between patients and their doctors that's critical and life-saving. This is a known problem. Now, I realize that this is sounding a little bleak, but I've got a few solutions and then an even better idea that I want you to take with you when you leave today. So let's go in that direction. Let's leave this man behind. So access starts well before Election Day. Increasingly, we're providing information online. There's sample ballots, everything you need to know, checking your registration. And I saw Center for Civic Design here today. Good design, good web page design goes a long way, as well as using plain language, sparse language, supplementing with visuals, diagrams. Even just if you are hiring sign language interpreters, why not get them to sign some videos that could be uploaded on that website as well, to also present this information in yet another language. So thinking ahead for good design, good use of language. Let's take it back to Election Day, when you first walk into that polling place. All those posters and written materials that are up everywhere telling you what you need to know. This is in no way an elections example, but this is not too bad of a sign. It uses clear design, sparse and simple language. It uses visuals. This is the type of thing, and this is probably a pretty familiar one, right? This is probably one we've all seen. Is it the best? I would leave that to Whitney, who's here for Center for Civic Design, to tell us if this could be done a little better. But this is the way we can be thinking about how we're presenting written materials, not just in multiple written languages, but in a format that makes the material easier to digest for all speakers of other languages. Okay, I will say I do think interpreters are ideal. To the extent in which you can, we heard from DC, post them in polling places where you know they're going to be needed, have on-call or roving interpreters. I think that's amazing. Technology is also starting to help us with solving some of the issues around the interpreter shortage. And I have one that I can show you here. It's called video remote interpreting. Now, this is becoming pretty common in a lot of business settings as well as in hospitals. It provides the opportunity to use a tablet or a laptop, something that's typically already in a polling place these days anyway, to have a live interpreter who can hear who's speaking and see who's signing and relay information back and forth. Now, this is where we're really going to get down to the core issue, because this is awesome when it's done well. But we already know a lot of hospitals are not doing this well. You get panicked nurses who aren't trained how to use it and they don't know what they're doing, which should sound familiar because it sounds exactly like a poll worker who was never taught how to use the touchscreen voting machine, and then a person with a disability rolls in and they don't know what to do. So it is on us to take whatever solutions are available to us and to implement them well, to use them well. So if you remember one thing I say today, and only one thing, it should be this. Seriously, just ask deaf people. Talk to voters who are deaf and hard of hearing. Ask them what barriers they're facing. Ask them what solutions they need. Elections, we know, are local and they're complex, and so are the barriers that different types of voters are facing. Find voters who are deaf and hard of hearing in those jurisdictions, ask them what they need, implement real baked-in solutions from how we look at the way we run elections from start to finish. After all, you're getting this presentation today from a hearing person. I'm not even fluent in ASL. I am actually notoriously bad at ASL. I can say roughly 3 things in sign language, and that would be thank you, you're bad, and Australian for sea turtle. This isn't even ASL, this is Aslan, this is Australian Sign Language. That's it. I also could say roughly 3 to 4 cuss words that I will not say in any language on this stage, nobody panic. I know this is being webcast. I am not the authority on this issue. I am not the go-to person for you on this issue. I am admittedly not a deaf person. Don't ask me, ask deaf people. If you remember one thing today, remember that. Now, if you remember 2 things today, you should also remember that if you start hearing reports that there's a sign language interpreter who's being paid very well to help voters who are deaf and hard of hearing in Northern Virginia, but coincidentally, the only thing she knows how to say is thank you, you're bad, and sea turtle, we all have to plan for our retirement, people. Please don't turn me in. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's give her one more round of applause for bringing such an important issue to our attention.